Okay, imagine this. A country spread over, what, 17,000 islands?
Yeah, it's vast.
And hundreds of different ethnic groups. Plus, it's the world's biggest Muslim majority nation. Quite a combination.
That's Indonesia, an incredibly complex place.
So today on the Deep Dive, we're really digging into its history. We've got this great overview source that covers, well, pretty much everything.
And it's quite a story. You see these amazing archaeological finds from way back, powerful kingdoms rising and falling.
Right.
The huge impact of trade, colonialism, obviously, and then this whole complicated journey to becoming the nation it is now.
Exactly. So our mission here is to pull out the really key stuff from that long history. Think of this as your shortcut to understanding Indonesia today by looking at where it came from.
Without getting totally bogged down in every single detail.
Right. We've looked at everything, old artifacts, analyses of the big political shifts, social changes.
And you really can't talk about Indonesia's history without mentioning its geography. I mean, sitting there between Asia and the Pacific.
A total crossroads.
Definitely. It shaped everything. The flow of people, trade, ideas, religion, constant interaction.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, like way back, before written records as we usually think of them. What did the sources tell us about that ancient period?
Well, the archaeology is pretty clear that there were well-established civilizations there centuries before the Common Era.
Really? Like what kind of evidence?
You see things like the megalithic culture in North Sumatra, traces of the Sikahurapan and Ceylon dynasties in Java, and they left behind some impressive stuff. Temples, stupas, those dome-shaped Buddhist shrines, even inscriptions in Sanskrit.
Sanskrit. Okay, so that points to early connections with India, right?
Absolutely, a significant early link.
And the source mentioned a specific building style, the Kandi. Lotus-like, it said. Can you expand on that? What's a Kandi exactly for our listeners?
Right, so a Kandi is basically a religious structure. You find them across Southeast Asia. But what's interesting about the Indonesian ones, like at Prambanan, is that they weren't just buildings. They were really sacred spaces. The Nandi model there, that's Lord Shiva on his bull, it's designed like a proper building, not just carved into a cave.
Ah, I see.
And that particular style is seen as, well, a key moment, kind of the start of a distinctly Indonesian art history.
So these Hindu and Buddhist influences were clearly shaping things early on. What were the next big kingdoms that emerged?
Well, after Srivijaya started to decline, and we can talk more about them in a sec, you get the rise of the kingdom of Majapahit. That was around the 14th century.
Majapahit, that name comes up a lot.
It does. It's often seen as a kind of golden age, especially under King Hayam Wuruk around 1350.
Yeah.
But eventually it faced its own problems, internal issues, and it fell to the newer Muslim states that were popping up in Java.
Okay, which brings us neatly to Islam's arrival. How did that happen? How did it change things?
It mostly came through trade, merchants arriving from West Asia. It was a gradual process, mostly peaceful interaction. And over time, this led to these powerful Islamic kingdoms becoming really influential places like Samudera Pasai, Demak, Banten.
And the landscape changes too, I guess. Mosques start appearing.
Exactly. Mosques, tombs, that kind of architecture becomes much more prominent.
You mentioned Banten. The sources seem to suggest it was pretty important strategically.
Oh, absolutely. Banten was a huge merchant town. Its location on Banten Bay was perfect, and crucially, it included the port of Sunda Kelapa.
Sunda Kelapa?
Yeah.
That's basically old Jakarta, isn't it?
Pretty much, yeah. It's amazing that area evolved into modern Jakarta, this massive global economic center. And you can still see historic buildings there that have that Islamic architectural style.
It's fascinating how these layers just build up. The sources also pointed out something interesting. Even when Islam became widespread, older Vedic traditions didn't just disappear. How did they manage to coexist?
Yeah, that's one of the really remarkable things. There was this surprising degree of cultural harmony. Even as Islam grew, elements of that earlier sort of Vedic pluralism, they hung on through a few things, really. Cultural blending, harmonization, they call it. Also, the influence of the royal courts, the Cretan. They were centers of culture and often synthesized different traditions.
Ah, the Cretan. For listeners, that's like a traditional Javanese palace, right? A center of power.
Exactly. And you also had customary laws, adat, which continued to be really important alongside Islamic law. The sources even compared it to Italy and Rome, how layers of history and culture accumulate.
That's a great analogy. Okay, before we jump into the colonial stuff, Let's just pause and appreciate the time scale here. We're talking about history going back way further than these big kingdoms, aren't we?
Oh, way further. Indonesia's prehistory is incredibly deep. I mean, you have the discovery of Java man, Pithecanthropus erectus,
Right, how old is that?
about 1.8 million years old, give or take. And there are other Homo erectus finds, plus evidence of the Hobbine culture coming in from mainland Southeast Asia maybe 6,000 years ago. So, humans have been living there for a very long time. And it's important to remember, new arrivals didn't just wipe out whoever was there before. There was a lot of mixing, integrating, adapting.
You mentioned the kingdom of Srivijaya earlier. Let's circle back to that. Why was it such a big deal?
Srivijaya, yeah. It pops up around the 7th century. It was a major player, politically and commercially, in Southeast Asia, huge maritime power.
Based where?
Key centers were places like Jambi and Palembang and Sumatra, right on those vital sea trade routes. They controlled a lot of traffic.
Did they have rivals?
Oh, yeah. They clashed with the Chola dynasty from India at times. And eventually, Srivijaya did fragment. It broke apart. But its influence, its style of statehood kind of lived on in the local states that came after it.
Okay. And then came Majapahit, which you mentioned as the Golden Age. Let's get into that a bit more. What made it so special?
Right, Majapahit. Founded around 1293, really hits its peak in the 14th century under Hayam Wuruk and his very famous chief minister, Gajah Mada.
Gajah Mada, right.
It was primarily a Hindu state, and its power stretched over a huge area, Java, Bali, bits of Sumatra, Borneo. It's really remembered as this high point of indigenous power and culture.
What did that look like on the ground? What kind of achievements are we talking about?
Well, you see the scale in their monuments. Things like Candi Tikas, they think it might have been a royal bathing complex.
Oh.
And other temples like Candi Pala, just covered in these elaborate sculptures. It shows real sophistication, artistic power. And interestingly, some evidence, like the Yoni inscription, suggests Majapahit might have been a major port state too.
So controlling trade routes.
Yeah, perfectly placed to connect trade between China, India, the Middle East. It wasn't just about land power.
Makes sense. And its economy wasn't just trade, right? Agriculture was important too.
Absolutely. They had a really strong agricultural base, rice, corn, spices, obviously, and they had advanced irrigation systems to support it.
And the royalty played a role in the economy.
Yeah, the sources mention a kind of remittance system, basically ways to encourage production and funnel wealth back to the state treasury, boosting overall prosperity.
Okay, so we've got this complex picture.
Yeah.
Ancient roots, powerful kingdoms, thriving trade, and then the Europeans show up. What kicks off the colonial era?
It starts with the Portuguese. They arrive in 1511, and they're laser focused on controlling the spice trade. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, that was like gold back then.
Right.
But the Dutch weren't far behind, and pretty soon you have this intense rivalry between them, fighting for control over those spice routes. That really sets the stage for centuries of European involvement.
And ultimately, it was the Dutch who really cemented their control.
Yeah, they were methodical about it, especially during the 17th century. They gradually pushed the Portuguese out, captured key spots like Tidor, beat them in the Moluccas and the Spice Islands.
Why the Moluccas specifically?
That's where the really valuable stuff, cloves and nutmeg, mainly grew. So the Dutch basically conquered those areas militarily to establish monopolies, control the source, control trade.
But they didn't stop at just spices, did they? Their ambitions grew.
No, definitely not. They pushed west into areas producing pepper, like Banten, and places making salt, like Cirebon. Then they took control of the Java Seacoast, largely for the sugar trade.
Sugar, too.
Oh, yeah, very lucrative. And they kept expanding east to Makassar, up into the Tanah Minang Highlands and Sumatra, grabbing control of other valuable resources and trade routes.
The sources mention some pretty wild stories about those early European explorers. Any standouts?
Yeah, there are some fascinating personal stories mixed in with the big geopolitics. Like, after the Portuguese took Malacca, you have these guys, Diego Silva de Mendes and Francisco Serrano, ending up in the Moluccas.
Okay.
And Mendes apparently converted to Islam and even married Serrano's niece. It shows, it wasn't always just conflict. There were these complex personal interactions happening too.
Wow. And it wasn't just the Portuguese and Dutch. Even the Ottoman Empire was interested. That seems surprising.
It does, doesn't it? But yeah, Sultan Selim II, the Ottoman Sultan, actually sent missions out to the Spice Islands. They wanted diplomatic ties, maybe trade.
What happened?
Well, one mission in 1564, led by a guy named Hoka Sinan, ended pretty badly. Their ship got wrecked, and the survivors ended up as prisoners of the Javanese.
Yikes.
But it just shows you how globally important this region was even back then. Everyone wanted a piece of the action.
And later voyages just kept coming, despite the risks.
Absolutely. Guys like Captain Moresco, Simon Rayton in the 17th century, they were still making these dangerous trips, casing spices, dealing with storms, diseases, and, of course, trying to outmaneuver their European rivals. It was relentless.
So all this exploration and competition eventually leads to full-blown Dutch colonization. How did that formal process start? What were the key moves?
Well, the Dutch first arrived in force around 1596. A really key moment was founding Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, as their headquarters. And a figure who looms large is Jan Pieter Zoon. He was pretty ruthless, pushing for Dutch settlement, using force to control spice prices, really consolidating the power of the Dutch East India Company, the VOC.
And that control over spices, particularly cloves and nutmeg, became their main focus early on.
Totally. By the 17th century, they established this very tight, often brutal monopoly. They set up an administration to manage it all and didn't hesitate to crush any local resistance that threatened their profits.
But there were still independent local kingdoms around at this time.
Oh yes, definitely. Powerful Islamic kingdoms still existed, which made the whole situation even more complex. The Dutch didn't control everything immediately, but their power was steadily growing.
So looking back over this long period of Dutch rule, what was the overall impact on Indonesia?
It was massive and complex, obviously huge economic exploitation. But also, while Islam stayed dominant for most people, the Dutch, and the English to some extent, brought in Western science, technology, military methods.
And that exposure had unintended consequences.
Exactly. Over time, seeing this Western power experiencing colonial rule, it actually helped foster a sense of Indonesian identity, a feeling of us versus them. It fueled opposition from early nationalists and Muslim groups who wanted the Dutch out.
You mentioned earlier that Islam arrived in stages before the Dutch really took over. Can you break that down a bit more?
Sure. The sources talk about roughly 3 phases. First, you have traders arriving, mostly from Gujarat in India and Arabia. They're doing business, but also sharing their faith peacefully.
Right.
Second, closer trade links develop with India and East Africa. This brings in more Islamic social customs, things like the calendar, mosque building becomes more common.
Right.
And the third phase is when you see Islamic political power really taking root. Local rulers convert, Islamic kingdoms are established starting around the 15th century, and trade was the common thread through all of this. It carried the ideas, the people, even supported pilgrimages to Mecca, which strengthened those ties.
Okay, so after centuries under the Dutch, things start to shift. We see the beginnings of organized resistance. How did that national awakening start in the early 20th century?
Well, the early 1900s see a lot of changes bubbling up. More schools are being set up, often by Indonesians themselves, not just the Dutch. This spreads new ideas. And social movements start forming, initially maybe around things like public health, but they quickly start asking bigger political questions, especially in Java. This idea of Java as a polis, like a shared public space with rights and duties, begins to emerge.
And demands for civil rights alongside that?
Exactly. People start demanding basic rights from the colonial government.
And this leads to actual organizations forming.
Yes, lots of them. Youth groups, labor unions fighting for workers, education leagues pushing for more schooling. It was this broad push for equality, for a voice, and it all builds towards a really crucial moment. The Youth Pledge of 1928.
The Youth Pledge. That sounds important. What was so significant about it?
It was incredibly significant. It's seen as this decisive step towards creating a unified Indonesian identity. You had young people from all different backgrounds, different islands, different ethnicities, different religions coming together.
What did they pledge?
They basically declared a shared vision. One nation, one motherland, one unifying language, Indonesian. It was a powerful statement of unity, brotherhood, putting that shared identity first. It laid the ideological groundwork for the future republic.
Where did this nationalism come from? What fueled it?
It's a mix of things. Islam itself provided a kind of common ground, a shared identity across many islands. Then you had global ideas filtering in liberty, equality from the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution changing things, nationalism rising in Europe.
Right.
But crucially, the experience of being colonized, the exploitation, the racism that was a huge unifying factor, it gave people something clear to unite against. And Islam often provided the framework, the moral justification for resisting the Dutch.
And specific movements started to take shape.
Yes. Early ones like Budi Utomo and Sarekat Islam are key. Budi from 1908 is often called the first real nationalist group, though maybe a bit focused on Javanese culture initially, perhaps a bit elitist, some said.
Yeah.
Sarakat Islam was different. It became a huge mass movement, really tapping into anti-colonial feelings among ordinary people. That shift from elite groups to mass movements was vital.
Fast forward a bit, the sources mention the 1998 reform movement. Is there a connection back to this earlier period?
Oh, absolutely. The Reformasi movement in 1998, the one that brought down Suharto, you can see it as picking up those threads from earlier struggles for democracy, for justice, for accountability, threads that had been suppressed for decades under the new order. Students, activists, teachers were driving it, echoing those earlier calls for change.
Let's go back to that youth pledge for a second. You said one nation, one motherland, one language. Were those the main points?
Yes, those were the core ideas. But the sources highlight four key tenets. One nation, Indonesia. One motherland, Indonesia. One language of unity, the Indonesian language. And significantly, one people, the Indonesian people. Very clear, very direct.
A powerful message.
Yeah.
And they tried to spread this message widely.
Definitely. It was declared in Jakarta, but the goal was to get it out everywhere. They made efforts to translate it, write it down in different scripts. Jawi, which many Muslims used, Javanese script. There was even talk of a Malay version to reach even more people across the islands.
So this national idea is growing, gaining momentum.
Yeah.
And then World War II hits, and the Japanese invade. How did that impact the independence movement?
The Japanese occupation was brutal, immense hardship. They initially dangled the promise of independence to get Indonesians on their side against the Dutch.
Right, or common tactic.
But it was mostly propaganda. They exploited resources, used forced labor, and when the Indonesian independence movement got too strong for their liking, they suppressed it. Life was grim for most people.
But paradoxically, didn't the Japanese occupation actually help the independence cause in some ways?
It did, in a strange way. The Dutch were defeated so quickly and completely by the Japanese in 1942, that shattered the image of Dutch invincibility.
Oh, okay.
And while the Japanese were occupiers themselves, driven by their own needs resources, weakening the Dutch, their victory created this power vacuum. It removed the Dutch colonial structure, and that gave Indonesian nationalists an opening they wouldn't have otherwise had.
What was life actually like under the Japanese military?
Well, the invasion in 42 was fast. They set up a military government. As I said, some initially saw them as liberators, and the Japanese tried to cultivate that with propaganda. But the reality was harsh forced labor, taking food and resources, crushing any real political dissent. It was complex exploitation, but also this unintended consequence of strengthening nationalist feelings against any foreign occupier. And crucially, as Japan started losing the war, the Indonesian leaders saw their chance.
Which led straight to the Proclamation of Independence, August 17th, 1945. A massive date.
Absolutely monumental. August 17th, 1945. Sukarno and Hatta, who were central figures in the movement, they stood up and declared Indonesia independent. Japan was collapsing, the timing was perfect, it was a bold move, and Sukarno became the first president, Hatta the vice president.
It's interesting, the Japanese had actually hinted at independence earlier, hadn't they, when they knew they were losing?
They had. In September 1944, with the Allies closing in, Tokyo said Indonesia would get independence in the near future. At the same time, the Dutch government, in exile in London, was proposing some kind of post-war federation. But the Indonesian nationalists weren't waiting for permission from anyone. They decided to seize the moment themselves.
So independence declared, but getting the world to recognize it was another battle.
Oh yeah, it wasn't automatic. Recognition came slowly. Indonesia really had to work for it, lobbying the new United Nations, building alliances. The Bandung Conference in 1955 was huge for that, bringing together Asian and African nations, many newly independent themselves. Eventually, they did get UN membership, which was a major step towards global legitimacy.
And the Dutch reaction to the declaration, I imagine they weren't thrilled.
Thrilled. They were furious. They absolutely expected to just walk back in and take over their colony again after Japan surrendered. They refused to recognize the republic.
So conflict was inevitable.
Pretty much. The Dutch tried to reassert control militarily, but the Indonesians were ready to fight. Many had gotten weapons, even some training during the Japanese period. They weren't giving up their declared independence. This led to years of intense fighting, the Indonesian National Revolution.
So August 17th wasn't the end, but really the start of another tough fight.
Exactly. The declaration was step one. Defending it against the Dutch, who had international backing initially, was step two. It was a period of intense struggle, diplomacy, and warfare.
Okay, so eventually after all that struggle, Indonesia does get recognized internationally. But the early years of the Republic were still pretty challenging.
Extremely challenging. You've just come through Japanese occupation, then a revolution against the Dutch. The country faced massive political instability, the economy was in ruins, and there was still military pressure, not just from the Dutch, but initially the British, too, who were involved in the region right after the war. Just holding the country together was a huge task.
And that's the context for the KMB negotiations in 1949, the Round Table Conference. What came out of that?
Right, the KMB in The Hague was crucial. After years of fighting and pressure, the Dutch finally agreed to formally transfer sovereignty. That happened officially on December 27th, 1949.
But there were strings attached.
Yes, big ones. Indonesia had to agree to take on the massive debts of the old Dutch East Indies government. And the initial structure wasn't a unitary state, but a federal one, the United States of Indonesia. The Dutch hoped that would keep it weaker, perhaps easier to influence.
But that federal system didn't last long. Sukarno and Hatta wanted a unified state.
Correct. They pushed hard to go back to a unitary republic, believing it was essential for national unity. So pretty quickly, they adopted the 1950 temporary constitution, which set up a parliamentary democracy.
Did that bring stability?
Unfortunately, no, not really. That period was marked by constant government changes. There were so many political parties all competing. It was almost impossible to form stable, lasting coalition governments. Lots of political infighting.
So declaring independence was one thing, but actually building the constitutional framework was another vital step. The 1945 Constitution was ratified later.
Yes, the 1945 Constitution, which was drawn up during the independence struggle, became the permanent foundation. It was based on the Pancasila philosophy, the 5 core principles of the state, and really embodied the spirit of that original 1945 proclamation.
Pancasila, can you remind listeners what that involves?
Sure. Pancasila is the state ideology. It's 5 principles: belief in the one God, just and civilized humanity, Indonesian unity, democracy guided by consensus, and social justice for all. It was meant to be this unifying framework for a very diverse nation. The founders wanted a representative government, protecting citizens' rights, all under a written constitution.
Sukarno, as the first president, his focus was very much on unity during those chaotic early years.
Very much so. Given all the turmoil, unity was his mantra. He argued for political cohesion, sometimes even at the expense of individual freedoms, arguing the nation needed to be strong first. And he increasingly relied on the military to maintain order.
Which led to the military becoming more powerful.
Yes, gradually. Civilian politicians sometimes got sidelined. A military advisory committee was set up, signaling their growing influence in state affairs.
Then things shift again towards what's called guided democracy under Sukarno, and then eventually Suharto takes over. A really dramatic period.
Hugely dramatic. Guided democracy was Sukarno's attempt to bring stability by concentrating power. But it ultimately led to more tension, culminating in the events of 1965 and Suharto's rise.
Right.
And Suharto's takeover introduced the new order. This was a period of much stronger military control over everything, and it began with this horrific anti-communist purge in 1965-66. Mass killings, wiping out the Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI. Political parties, other groups seen as opposition, were banned or forced to merge. Golkar, the state-backed political vehicle, became completely dominant.
The 1965 coup itself, the sources mention it's still debated. What exactly happened?
It is. The narrative around the alleged coup attempt on October 1st, 1965, who was behind it. The exact sequence of events, it's still very sensitive and contested in Indonesian history. Different groups have very different interpretations.
But the aftermath is clear.
The aftermath, tragically, is brutally clear. A massive violent crackdown targeting anyone associated with the PKI or just perceived as left-leaning. Huge numbers were killed, especially in Java and Bali. It completely decimated the PKI and ushered in decades of authoritarian rule.
So under Suharto's new order, political freedom was heavily restricted.
Very much so. While the government focused on economic development, dissent was not tolerated. Muslim intellectuals who were critical often faced restrictions. Anti-Chinese sentiment was sometimes manipulated. Golkar, backed by the army and the bureaucracy, controlled the political landscape. If you had any past links to the left, you faced discrimination. Mass organizations were controlled. Political life was very constrained.
How did the economic approach change from Sukarno to Suharto?
Quite dramatically. Sukarno had focused on nationalizing industries, state control, trying to build economic self-sufficiency, but it often led to instability, high inflation. Suharto went the other way. The new order prioritized rapid economic growth, opening up to foreign investment, following advice from institutions like the World Bank.
Did it work?
Well, Indonesia saw significant GDP growth for many years, but it often came with conditions like cutting subsidies on fuel or rice, which hit poor people hard, and corruption became a massive problem.
The sources also mention human rights across different eras. Was there a concept of rights before Western influence?
Yes, that's an important point. Ideas about justice, fairness, social harmony certainly existed in Indonesian traditions and religions long before colonialism. But how those ideals were put into practice often varied and didn't always align with modern universal human rights concepts. Power imbalances definitely played a role.
Okay, so Suharto's long rule, the New Order, eventually ends with the Reformasi movement in the late 90s. What caused that shift?
The main trigger was the Asian financial crisis of 1997-98. It hit Indonesia incredibly hard. The economy collapsed, prices soared, people lost jobs.
Right, I remember that.
That economic disaster unleashed all the pent-up frustration that had been building for years, anger about corruption, the lack of political freedom, cronyism, human rights abuses, limits on the press. It all exploded into massive protests and riots.
Primarily demanding Suharto resign.
Yes. The main cry was for Suharto to step down and for fundamental reforms, Reformasi.
And he did step down after 32 years, May 1998. A huge moment.
Absolutely huge. The pressure from students, activists, parts of the political elite, the sheer scale of the unrest, it became untenable for him to stay. His resignation marked the end of an era.
What came next? This transition to democracy.
Well, it was the beginning of Indonesia's Reformasi period, a push towards democracy. Students were really vocal, demanding accountability for the past, demanding an end to KKN, that's corruption, cronyism, and nepotism, which were rampant under Suharto.
Has the transition been smooth?
Not entirely smooth, no. Indonesia has definitely made huge strides. Free elections, a much more open civil society. But challenges remain. Politics can be very personalized. Political parties aren't always that strong or ideologically coherent. Elite networks still hold a lot of power. Many people would say Indonesian democracy is still consolidating, still a work in progress.
And the economy. How has it fared since the '98 crisis?
There's been a significant recovery since then. Indonesia got back to pretty strong economic fundamentals in the 2000s. But persistent problems remain, things like energy security, food price stability, unemployment, poverty levels are still concerns, and environmental issues are becoming more pressing.
So painting a picture of Indonesia today, what are the key features?
Well, you've got the world's largest archipelago, incredibly diverse, the most populous Muslim-majority democracy. Politically, it's undergone massive changes since '98. The constitution was amended 4 times, leading to big shifts in government structure, much more power decentralized to regions. But navigating that diversity and making the political system work effectively is an ongoing process.
And economically, that historical pattern of uneven development between Java and other islands, is that still an issue?
Yes, it remains a challenge. Remember, the Dutch focused heavily on Java for agriculture and administration, while mostly just extracting resources elsewhere. Post-independence governments have tried to create more balanced development, invest across the archipelago, but closing those historical gaps takes time. Regional disparities are still significant.
Shifting gears a bit, the sources mentioned drug use. What was the point being made there?
It was about complexity. Official stats might show low drug use, but that can be misleading, partly because of how data is gathered, but also because some substances have traditional uses in rituals or medicine, which complicates the picture. The point was you need to look beyond just crime statistics and understand the social, political, even family context of drug use to really address it effectively.
And that underlying theme of unity and diversity still central today.
Absolutely critical. How do you maintain national cohesion with so many languages, ethnicities, cultures spread across thousands of islands? It's the fundamental challenge. Education? Promoting that shared Indonesian identity, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, unity and diversity, is constantly emphasized. But the Reformasi era, while bringing freedom, also saw some old ethnic and religious tensions resurface in places, showing it's an ongoing project.
Indonesia also has this incredibly rich artistic heritage.
Oh, definitely. Things like wayang kulit, the shadow puppet theater. It's not just entertainment. It's storytelling, philosophy, social commentary, all rolled into one. UNESCO recognized it as vital, intangible heritage. And the styles vary so much from region to region, reflecting that deep cultural diversity.
Finally, let's zoom out. How does Indonesia see its place in the world today?
It definitely sees itself as a major player, especially in Southeast Asia. It was a founder of ASEAN, hosted the historic Bandung Conference back in '55, promoting non-alignment. It generally tries to play a constructive, leading role in the region and among developing nations. Its foreign policy is usually described as free and active, non-aligned, but engaged, though sometimes domestic issues can limit its bandwidth for international affairs.
And its history of interacting with the world goes way back, even before independence.
Absolutely. From ancient kingdoms plugged into global trade routes to the fight for recognition at the UN, Indonesia's always been connected internationally. Though the sources note it can sometimes be harder to find detailed accounts of its international relations from an Indonesian perspective, especially for the pre-independence era, in English language sources at least.
And like everywhere else, Indonesia's facing major environmental challenges now.
Yes, big time. Population growth, demand for timber, land for agriculture, palm oil. It's led to serious deforestation in many areas. This causes soil erosion, increases risks of floods and landslides. It's a huge issue for a country with such incredible biodiversity.
And climate change must be a huge concern for an archipelago nation.
Extremely vulnerable. Being on the equator, thousands of islands, low-lying coastal areas, it's exposed to sea level rise, changes in monsoon patterns, potentially more extreme weather like floods and droughts. This obviously threatens agriculture, fishing, coastal communities. They're already seeing temperatures rise and more hot days. It's a major future challenge.
Wow, okay, that was quite a journey through Indonesian history. From ancient kingdoms through trade, religion, colonialism, revolution, nation building. Just incredible complexity. What are the big themes that really stick out for you?
For me, it's that theme of resilience, maybe, and adaptation. How Indonesian societies constantly absorbed and responded to outside influences, Indian religions, Islam, European colonialism, global culture, but always synthesized them into something uniquely Indonesian. And also this continuous effort to forge unity out of unbelievable diversity. That's a constant thread.
Yeah, definitely. I was struck by that too, how older traditions often survived alongside the new, creating this unique blend. And just the sheer impact of the spice trade, how it pulled the outside world in, for better and worse, plus those really dramatic political shifts since independence. It's a reminder of how dynamic and, well, turbulent nation building can be.
Right.
So for you listening, why does this matter? Well, understanding these historical currents gives you so much context for Indonesia today. It's a huge, important country, and its past deeply shapes its present and future.
And it leaves you with a big question, really. In a place shaped by so many different forces, internal and external, how do you continuously define and redefine what it means to be Indonesian? Their journey navigating diversity, tradition, modernity, global pressures, it holds lessons for so many other countries facing similar complexities today. Maybe think about which parts of Indonesia's story resonate with how you think about national identity and development elsewhere.